owner's non-delegable duty, airworthiness inspection programs, and the rules that actually matter. Hello, this is Forrest Owens. I'm an aviation lawyer, private pilot, and an FAA licensed airframe and power plant mechanic. Now let's begin with the most important maintenance point in private aviation, because it is also the one owners most often misunderstand. Maintenance can be delegated in practice, but responsibility for airworthiness cannot be outsourced away. This is not a slogan. It's in the regulations under 14 CFR section 91.403A. The owner or operator is primarily responsible for maintaining the aircraft in an airworthy condition, including compliance with Part 39 airworthiness directives. For large turbine aircraft, that language matters because sophisticated ownership structures often create potential dangerous illusions. The LLC owns the airplane, the manager coordinates the trips, the maintenance department talks to the service center, the crew writes up the squawks, but if the aircraft is not airworthy, the FAA does not treat that as an abstract paperwork failure. It treats it as the owner's problem. Here's something to remember. The airplane does not care who outsourced the work, and neither does the regulations. On large turbine aircraft, the maintenance baseline is also different from the annual inspection mindset many people associate with smaller airplanes. Section 91.409E says no person may operate a large airplane, turbojet multi-engine airplane, turbo propeller powered multi-engine airplane, or turbine powered rotocraft unless life-limited replacement times are complied with and the aircraft is inspected under one of the inspection programs allowed by Section 91.409F. And this is an important and fundamental point. These aircraft are not maintained intelligently by calendar reminders and optimism. They are maintained by a selected program, identified in the records, and administered with discipline. Section 91409F gives the owner or operator 4 paths. One is a continuous airworthiness inspection program currently used by Part 121 or qualifying Part 135 operators. One is an approved aircraft inspection program currently used under Part 135. One is the manufacturer's current inspection program, and one is another program established by the owner or operator and approved by the FAA. FAA Advisory Circular 91-90 explains how owner-specific approved inspection programs are developed and reviewed. So when a large turbine owner says, we just maintained it to manufacturer's recommendations, my first question is, which selected inspection programs or program identified where and administered by whom? A second misconception involves service bulletins. Owners often hear two simplistic statements. One camp says every manufacturer bulletin is mandatory. Another says service bulletins are just advisory and can be ignored. Both statements are wrong in the way that matters. The FAA explains in its service bulletins and the aircraft owner guidance that for Part 91 operators, a service bulletin is advisory unless it is incorporated into an airworthiness directive. But that doesn't make it irrelevant. Some service information becomes functionally critical because it addresses known failure modes, supports continued value, or ties into mandatory airworthiness limitations. That leads to the third point. Owners must understand the difference between service bulletins, airworthiness directives, and airworthiness limitations. Under 14 CFR Part 39, It establishes the legal framework for airworthiness directives. And Section 39.7 makes clear that anyone operating a product that does not meet an applicable AD is in violation of Section 91403C. Separately, requires compliance with mandatory replacement times, inspection intervals, and related procedures in the airworthiness limitation sections, unless an approved alternative exists. In other words, on large turbine aircraft, you do not have one maintenance universe. You have a layered system. The selected inspection program, the mandatory AD universe, and mandatory airworthiness limitation universe. That layered system becomes very expensive when life-limited parts are not tracked correctly. Section 1.1 defines a life-limited part as a part with a mandatory replacement limit specified in a type design or instructions for continued airworthiness. And Section 43.10 governs the disposition of those parts. In turbine ownership, life status is money. It affects dispatch reliability, financing, insurance underwriting, and resale. A buyer can survive a cosmetic defect. A buyer cannot casually survive uncertainty over cycle-controlled turbine hardware, landing gear components, or engine LLP status. A fourth point is return to service after maintenance. Section 91407 says that no person may operate an aircraft after maintenance, preventive maintenance, rebuilding, or alteration unless it has been approved for return to service by a person authorized under Section 43.7. And the required maintenance record entry has been made under Sections 43.9 and 4311. If the maintenance may have appreciably changed the aircraft's flight characteristics or substantially affected its operation in flight, Section 91.407B requires an appropriately rated pilot to perform an operational flight check and log it, unless ground tests or inspections conclusively show that no such flight is required. A real-world example shows why this matters. In October 2025, the NTSB issued urgent recommendations involving certain Learjet models after preliminary findings pointed to a maintenance assembly issue in the landing gear trunnion pin and retaining bolt. The board said that the misassembly was not readily detectable during routine maintenance or pre-flight inspection and urged action affecting 1,883 airplanes in service. That is not an owner lesson, not just a mechanic lesson. Complex turbine aircraft require post-maintenance verification steps that are robust enough to catch the error that routine familiarity misses. That is why aircraft owners should be reminded, on a large turbine aircraft, maintenance is not a shop event. It's a government system. The first government question is whether the owner knows the aircraft's actual inspection program and who is responsible for scheduling it. The second is whether AD's airworthiness limitations and life-limited components are tracked in one coherent system. The third is whether the return to service process includes independent verification for high consequence work. And the fourth is whether the owner receives reporting that is meaningful enough to expose risk before the next trip, financing event, or sale process. In short, the first key maintenance consideration is understanding that large turbine ownership begins with a non-delegable regulatory duty. You must know the inspection program, know the mandatory items, know the life limits, and know who actually releases the aircraft back into service. Here's something for you to remember and take away. Keep this in mind. If you own a large turbine aircraft, maintenance is not overhead. It is the legal infrastructure of airworthiness. Records, engines, deferred items, and the economics of staying airworthy. Now let's turn to the second layer of the maintenance analysis, the place where technical compliance, cash flow, and aircraft value all meet. The records and program architecture behind the airplane. For a large turbine owner, maintenance records are not clerical afterthoughts. They are the aircraft's legal memory. Section 91417 requires the registered owner or operator to keep records of maintenance, preventative maintenance, alterations, and required or approved inspections for the aircraft and its major components, and to retain certain status records and transfer them with the aircraft. Sections 43.9 and 4311 define what maintenance and inspection entries must contain. FAA Advisory Circular 43-9D reinforces the practical point. Good records keeping is part of showing continued compliance. That matters because large turbine aircraft are sold, financed, insured, imported, exported, enrolled on programs, and scrutinized in pre-buy inspections largely through their records. A paper gap can become a value gap very quickly. The airframe may look magnificent on the ramp, but if the records cannot prove inspection status, component status, damage history, alteration approval, and return to service continuity, the airplane becomes harder to finance, harder to sell, and harder to defend. Here is something I want you to remember. In turbine ownership, the logbooks are not about the past. They really decide the next transaction. Owners also need to separate the airframe story from the engine and APU story. On large turbine and super mid-sized jets, the true maintenance exposure often concentrates in the engines, the APU, the landing gear, avionics, and other high-value systems. The selected inspection program may keep the aircraft compliant, but it does not itself eliminate risk. That is why disciplined owners look beyond due dates and ask more strategic questions. What major events are approaching? What is their likely cost? And how are those costs being managed? In practice, that means tracking hot section exposure, overhaul cycles, restoration events, LLP stacks, trend monitoring, bore scope findings, and program enrollment status with the same seriousness used to track the next calendar inspection. Whether an owner uses an OEM program, a third-party engine program, or direct pay maintenance, the legal lesson is the same. If the program status affects the value and operability, the owner should receive formal, recurrent reporting on deposits, exclusions, transferability, and major event exposure. Large turbine owners also underestimate the maintenance consequences of avionics, equipment compliance. Under sections 91411, IFR operation in controlled airspace depends on timely static systems, altimeter, and altitude reporting tests and inspections. Under section 91413, required ATC transponders must be tested and inspected within the preceding 24 calendar months, and on certain maintenance that could affect data correspondence. FAA AC, or Advisory Circular 43-6D, provides acceptable practices for those tests and the associated maintenance entries. These are not glamorous items, but missed tests can ground a highly sophisticated aircraft just as effectively as a major mechanical defect. The same is true for inoperative equipment. Section 91213 says an aircraft generally may not take off with inoperative instruments or equipment installed unless the applicable conditions are met. For aircraft operated with an MEL, the aircraft must have the approved MEL and letter of authorization. For aircraft operated under Section 91213D, the analysis still requires care. FAA Advisory Circular AC 9167A explains acceptable methods for Part 91 operations with certain inoperative items. Section 91405 then imposes owner obligations to repair, replace, remove, or inspect permitted inoperative items at the next required inspection and to ensure required placarding. That is why deferred items is not a free item, it's a managed item with conditions. Owners of large turbine aircraft sometimes talk about just flying with the squawk for a while as if it's a choice. It was purely operational. But under the regulations, every deferred discrepancy is part of a documented compliance path. It has to fit the MEL or the Part 91 inoperative equipment framework, be properly recorded, be properly placarded if required, and revisited when the next inspection arrives. A casual deferral culture is one of the fastest ways to convert manageable maintenance into compounding noncompliance. There's also a practical records lesson here. A well-run turbine aircraft should have maintenance records that answer 5 questions immediately. What inspection program applies? What required inspections and tests are next due? What life-limited components are currently installed and what is their remaining life? What deferred items exist and on what authority? And finally, what major maintenance events are approaching that will affect downtime and cost? A real-world enforcement style example shows what happens when records stop telling the truth. In Lawson versus Hutra, later mechanics found that the aircraft's records did not line up with its actual condition, and the FAA established multiple false entries tied into maintenance and alteration work. The case did not involve a large cabin business jet transaction, but the lesson transfers directly to turbine ownership. Not a record discrepancy can become not merely a resale problem, but an airworthy and certificate problem. So the owner strategy has to be broader than to hire a good maintenance provider. Good providers matter, but owners need process discipline. That means digital record retention with source document integrity, monthly status reporting, component forecasting, a discrepancy closure system, and pre-buy readiness even when no sale is planned. Why pre-buy readiness? Because the day you prepare the aircraft as if it could be inspected by a buyer is often the day you discover whether your maintenance administration is truly defensible. In short, the key maintenance consideration is that records, engines, equipment tests, and deferred items are not separate topics. Together, they can form the economic operating system for the aircraft. Here's something to take away. On a large turbine aircraft, poor maintenance planning usually appears first as a paperwork problem. It then appears as a dispatch problem, and finally as a value problem. Where owners actually get hurt, interface failures, hidden damage, and a defensible maintenance strategy. Finally, let's discuss where large turbine owners usually get hurt in the real world. Because the biggest maintenance losses rarely begin with a wrench alone, they usually begin at the interface between people, systems, and assumptions. The first danger zone is the owner-managed repair station gap. A management company may schedule the inspection. The service center may perform the work. The crew may write up the discrepancy. But if nobody owns the decision architecture, important items fall into the seams. One team thinks another team is tracking the airworthiness limitation. Another assumes the engine program provider is managing all reserve issues. Someone believes a service bulletin is merely optional when in context is critical to conti- continued reliability or tied to another mandatory requirement. The result is not one dramatic error, it is a sequence of quiet omissions. That's why owners need to remember that maintenance risk on large turbine aircraft lives, again, at the seams, not in the obvious line item, in the seam between the line items. The second danger zone is post maintenance complacency. High end aircraft create high end confidence. The aircraft looks polished, the service center is reputable, the invoice is substantial. Everyone assumes the risk has been reduced because money was spent. But Section 91407 reminds us that after certain maintenance, the legal question is not whether the bill was paid. The question is whether the aircraft was properly approved for return to service, properly documented, and when required, properly checked before carrying passengers. The Learjet recommendations issued by the NTSB in 2025 make that point with unusual force. The board's preliminary findings identified a large gear maintenance vulnerability that was not readily detectable during routine maintenance or pre-flight inspection. That is precisely the sort of large turbine lesson owners should remember. Some maintenance errors hide behind normal-looking airplanes. They are found only when verification was designed well enough to catch them. A third danger zone is hidden damage and undocumented history. Large turbine aircraft can accumulate corrosion, hard landing history, foreign object damage, structural repairs, undocumented modifications, cannibalized components, or records gaps that do not stop today's flight but absolutely affect tomorrow's value and insurability. The owner who says it's flying fine may be making a technical observation is far less important than the legal and economic one. Can the aircraft records prove what the aircraft actually is? This is where disciplined maintenance governance becomes memorable. It's recommended that aircraft owners think in 3 files, not one. File number 1 is the legal airworthiness file. Inspection program, ADs, airworthiness limitation, return to service entries, test requirements, and due lists. File number 2 is the technical risk file, recurring discrepancies, trend monitoring data, engine and APU exposure, corrosion control, vendor findings, and service history patterns. File number 3 is the transaction file, records completeness, damage and repair substantiation, alteration approvals, component traceability, and program transfer readiness. When those 3 files tell the same story, the aircraft is easier to operate and easier to defend. A fourth area to consider is treating maintenance as a vendor relationship instead of an owner-controlled function. The best turbine owners do not merely approve invoices. They establish maintenance policy. They decide what requires second-level review. They define which discrepancy must be elevated immediately. They require written forecasting for major upcoming events. They demand consistency between the aircraft records, the maintenance tracking software, the engine program statements, and the actual installed configuration. And that kind of discipline is what makes a maintenance strategy defensible. And defensibility is the right word. It matters if the FAA asks questions. It matters if the lender performs collateral review. It matters if an insurer investigates a claim. It matters if a buyer opens the records room. And it matters if an incident occurs and counsel later has to prove that the owner did not simply rely on assumptions. So, what should a large turbine owner do as a practical strategy? First, identify the selected inspection program in the records and confirm who is responsible for scheduling every required task. Second, build one master status view that integrates inspections, ADs, airworthiness limitations, life limited parts, engine program status, and deferred items. Third, require enhanced verification for high consequence maintenance, especially flight controls, landing gear, pressurization, engine related work, or any task that could materially affect flight characterizations. Fourth, preserve complete records in digital form, but retain source document integrity. Fifth, run periodic independent maintenance audits, not because you distrust your providers, but because turbine aircraft are too complex to manage on confidence alone. Here is something to remember. And in closing, the safest maintenance budget is not the one that buys clarity before it buys urgency. Large turbine ownership rewards discipline and it punishes ambiguity. The owner who keeps these aircraft lawful, reliable, and valuable are usually not the ones who spend the least. They are the ones who know exactly what they are buying and every maintenance dollar, compliance, evidence, reliability, and preserve value. In short, the most important maintenance considerations for owners of large turbine aircraft are not only mechanical, they are also legal, documentary, operational, and economic all at once. When those four dimensions are aligned, the aircraft is not merely airworthy on paper, it is managed in a way that can withstand scrutiny. And here's something to take away and remember. In large turbine ownership, the maintenance strategy that protects safety is usually the same strategy that protects value. Thank you for your interest in this topic. This information is provided for informational purposes only, and it should not be construed as legal advice. Questions are always welcome. Please direct them to admin@aviationlegalcounsel.com. We look forward to helping you navigate these issues and answer your questions with precision.